Hello, good afternoon. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Thursday, November 13th, 2025. The time is 2:25 p.m., and I am in Miami, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is Gangstalking and Terrorism. And before I begin this lecture, I would like to address a number of matters that have been of concern to me recently. First and foremost, we have a lot of things happening in the world today. We have the tensions that have arisen from the Israel-Palestinian conflict. We have the tensions that have arisen from the fallout with respect to the South African government going to the United Nations and formally filing charges of genocide against Israel. We have the Israeli response with respect to its self-defense against various militant elements in Palestine with respect to Hamas. We have the United States' stance on the matter with respect to the October 7th massacre and Israel's response. We have a situation where the sitting United States president is attempting to moderate reconciliations between various countries that have had conflicts that go back many decades, many generations. We have the Supreme Court of the United States making historic rulings on various matters. We have a new generation that is reaching adulthood here in the United States and around the world. We have the economic situation in America reaching new plateaus with the various technological innovations that are being made in artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency, innovations in automotive technology and in-home technology with the Internet of Things. We have a new pope in the Vatican, and we have a situation where historic things are happening with that pope. For example, the King of England, His Majesty King Charles III, prayed with the Pope. And this prayer meeting is the first of its kind in 500 years. This historic prayer meeting is one of historical relevance, not necessarily because the worldwide Christian establishment has demanded it. I don't think most persons that identify as Christian in the world were aware that the Pope had not prayed with the King of England in 5 centuries. I think this was a show of diplomacy by King Charles III, who wanted to show the world that he is not anti-religious, but he is pro-civilization. And I believe that the Christian establishment in England and across the world should take note to the political and theological significance of this meeting. I don't believe that it will increase Christian participation with respect to more persons going to church, etc., etc. But I do think it shows that the King of England sees the socio-political importance of keeping in contact with His Holiness the Pope. Me personally, I am of the mindset that Christianity and religion in general are for the psychological stability of the masses. It gives people some semblance of a creator and some semblance of being able to attain some sort of a future in the hereafter that is acceptable, having lived a life on earth in accordance with Christian precepts. Me personally, I'm of the mindset that religions bring one closer to the unseen, although the unseen itself is beyond the intelligible capacity of human beings with respect to their ability to have a perfect idea of the supernatural, of their creator, and of true righteousness, which is in every person, regardless of your level of faith, regardless of what God you worship, and regardless of the socio-economic or socio-political conundrums that face this country. I believe that religion's core function is to assist governments in helping the general population see the importance of sane living and the cultivation of societies. Now, having said that, I would like to get into terrorism and gangstalking. And I would like to draw a clear connection for you as to the clear lines that both gangstalking and terrorism rest upon in tandem. Now, you may have heard that the United States ambassador to the United Nations went before member countries in the United Nations and openly and definitively declared Cuba as a terrorist state, a state sponsoring terrorism, and an active participant in terrorist activities, human trafficking, the support of drug cartels, and other atrocious actions to which the representatives from Cuba stepped in with a rebuttal, namely to illustrate that they thought that the accusations were unfair. The ambassador to the United Nations disagreed, and the debate continues. Me personally, I believe that assertion. Okay, a United States ambassador does not pull such accusations out of thin air. These accusations against Cuba, for example, are rooted in federal investigations into the matter. And it isn't just a random occurrence that Cuba was accused of participating in state-sponsored terrorism. Cuba was designated a terrorist state by the United States many, many years ago. In 2024, if I'm not mistaken, President Joe Biden removed Cuba from that list, but the Trump administration is looking to get Cuba back on the list of active state sponsors of terrorism. Now, the parallel that I draw between that accusation, which I consider to be the truth, and the things that I see here in South Florida are, in my mind, credible and with merit. Okay, the brand of gang stalking that I see here in South Florida is reminiscent of guerrilla warfare tactics, which are tantamount to the preferred method of warfare, particularly urban warfare, that persons who are active in terrorism prefer. Guerrilla warfare is fairly easy to stage. It doesn't require very sophisticated weapons, and large numbers of persons can participate in it with average or below average military strategic formation intelligence. And one must ask oneself, How does the population of South Florida find itself participating in guerrilla warfare or semi-guerrilla warfare tactics with no military training at all? It's because the trajectory of the type of gang stalking that takes place here in South Florida is in tandem with the interests of federal, state, and local liaisons, federal, state, and local undercover operatives, and gang stalkers across the socioeconomic spectrum, across the demographic spectrum, working in tandem to implement a terroristic environment for persons who have been marked as suspicious or otherwise deleterious. Okay? It takes strategic formation intelligence to orchestrate synchronization, to covertly follow a subject down a sidewalk, using a combination of pedestrians, vehicles, aerial drones, long distance and short distance surveillance equipment, audio visual surveillance equipment, the use of traffic lights, the use of the cameras that sit atop those traffic lights, the use of various other CCTV or commercial grade surveillance equipment that may rest on the side of buildings and homes, the use of secret or hidden cameras which may be present on passing vehicles or on pedestrians that the targeted individual comes in contact with, the use of thermal imaging technology which allows interested parties to observe the targeted individual while he is inside of a building. Okay, stalkers no longer have to go inside the building with a target. They can stalk a target from outside the building with thermal imaging technology. You have night vision technology that a number of interested third parties are using to surveil the target at night. You have military, industrial, strategic formations that are used against the targeted person throughout the day. You have the good old-fashioned false narrative building mechanism that gang stalkers, undercover operatives, and federally authorized liaisons use in tandem to keep the target in their sights and constantly have a viable reason to continue to disrupt the target. You have various technologies that are aimed at making the target disoriented Okay, you have synchronized food contamination, which could cause sickness in the target. You have synchronized lead poisoning, which could make the target weak. You have the synchronous spread of airborne bacteria, which stalkers, liaisons, and undercover operatives alike use to contaminate the target's breathing space so as to enhance and increase the opportunities for sickness to come upon the target. You have the lack of oversight that stalkers, liaisons, and undercovers have from the federal government in their operations on the ground, which allow them to act with impunity whenever they go about their day, whenever they go about their mission. And that allows undercover operatives, stalkers, and liaisons to operate in a way that is hostile or annoying with no recourse, no penalty, and no consequences. You have the community mobbing mechanism that could result in collisions on foot or bicycle from pedestrian to stalker. And you also have the indoctrination mechanism, which allows liaisons, operatives, and stalkers to indoctrinate one another as to the targeted person's character. This is a way to guarantee that if liaisons, operatives, or stalkers come in contact with the target, they will have a hostile demeanor towards him because they have already been pre-programmed to see the target as either a threat or someone who does not deserve their actual freedom. You have the false association narrative that gang stalkers, liaisons, and undercover operatives use against targeted persons, in which they cross-instruct each other and cross-inform each other about a targeted person's affiliations. Okay, they will find some degenerate felon and signal them to a stalker's general location, perhaps to the bus stop that the target is waiting at, or to a restaurant that the target is eating at, as some sort of an indicator that that person or that criminally inclined person and the target are either friends, affiliates, or partners in crime. Oftentimes, persons with criminal records will be signaled to a target to ask to use the target's phone to make a quick phone call as a favor, because they'll come up with some excuse. Well, my phone's battery is out, or I lost my phone. Can I please use your phone to call somebody? If the target is generous and helpful to that request, what they will do is take the target's mobile device and place a phone call to a known criminal so that it will look like, via the data records keeping mechanism for your phone carrier, that your phone dialed the number of that criminal. But it was not you, it was a stalker trying to make you look as if you're affiliated with criminals or deleterious people. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, I never lend my phone out to random strangers who ask to use my phone for a quick phone call. Chances are they are looking to call somebody who has a known history of corruption or criminal activity, Even if that phone call is not completed, the number is dialed, and you look complacent in criminal activity, that is a stalker's way of wiping dirt on the targeted individual in case any law enforcement body were to comb through a targeted person's call log and check the numbers. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, false associations are a huge part of gang stalking, and they are used as a justification for the subsequent acts of domestic terrorism that are perpetrated against a targeted individual. So let's get into the terroristic elements of clandestine gang stalking, which is a program that was implemented by stealth through the United States Congress on the coattails of national security legislation, particularly post 9/11, although plans have been in the works for this program for a good 60 years now. So, for one, bioterrorism is an act of terrorism in which massive quantities of persons are made sick from the use of biological hazardous materials, biological hazardous waste, or biological or hazardous persons. Now, with respect to a targeted person, it's difficult to quantify how many of their personal bouts with sicknesses, diseases, or illnesses are caused by actual chemical weapons, biological weapons, which can include any number of weapons. I mean, you have bombs and other such explosive devices that have biohazardous liquids or other biohazardous materials inside the bomb. So when the bomb explodes, those bacteria or those viral amoebas are spread throughout a generalized area with the intention of getting as many people sick as you possibly can in a short period of time. Gang stalkers use a similar sickness and disease spreading mechanism, although it's difficult to know whether or not actual bombs containing biohazardous materials are used. In clandestine gang stalking campaigns, it looks more like this. A targeted individual is sitting on a bus. A liaison, an undercover operative, or a stalker who have been signaled to the target's bus and exact location on the bus to spread germs, diseases, illnesses, or some other deleterious condition that could cause the targeted person to become sick. They sit directly behind the target if possible, or if not, they sit directly beside the target if possible. The person signaled to the targeted individual's exact location is sick, and the liaison or the undercover operative who made the signal to sit next to the target had foreknowledge that the person was sick. The person is instructed beforehand to try and generate a contaminated airspace for the targeted individual, so that person who carries the sickness, whatever that sickness may be, will sit down next to the target and intentionally and almost immediately begin flinging those germs in the air next to the target in the way of violent coughing, violent sneezing. Sometimes they put one hand on one nostril and blow snot in the air. They sometimes
sit directly next to or behind the targeted person and begin breathing heavily to where their contaminated breath, or rather the contaminated air from their breath, reaches and makes contact with the targeted individual's skin. And similar tactics, and it doesn't have to be on a bus. It doesn't have to be on a train. It could be in the open. It could be at a bus stop. I've had this happen where I was at a bus stop or somewhere where I was seated or resting, and a stalker who was sick walked up to me in close quarters and started trying to initiate a long conversation with me about something random. That is a state-sanctioned disease-spreading tactic and an act of bioterrorism. And the reason I call it an act of bioterrorism is because if enough persons are made sick by these strategic mechanisms, then that means that it is a function. That the creation of diseases for people, or the creation of bacterial infections for people, is not one or two acts of random violence, but it is a mass occurrence. Different people's bodies react differently to sicknesses and diseases. So if one of these sick gang stalkers are signaled to your location and begin a conversation with you in which they get very close to you so that the contaminated air from their nose and mouth reach your skin, because mind you, when you talk, your mouth and your nose expel air. Air from the mouth and the nose contain moisture. The moisture from your mouth and your nose contains bacteria naturally. When you're sick, there's elevated levels of bacteria in the air that leaves your mouth and your nostrils. If you are sick and you have been instructed or signaled or otherwise directed to spread that sickness to an unsuspecting person, and you approach that person with the intention of creating a long conversation with that person, with the further intention of the contaminated moisture from your mouth and nose reaching that person's skin, you are participating in an act of a biohazardous assault on another person. I've had that happen where stalkers approach me out of nowhere, people I've never seen or heard from in my life, and begin trying to start long conversations with me with contaminated materials in their mouth and nostrils, particularly the air and moisture. I terminate those conversations quickly if I can decipher that the person I'm speaking to is sick. Because if they carry a prolonged conversation with you, especially at close range, and they're talking directly into your face, the contaminated breath and moisture from their nostrils and mouth, once it reaches your skin, if for prolonged periods of time, it can make you sick as well. If you have thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of persons that participate in gang stalking's covert signaling mechanism, being signaled to unsuspecting American citizens in massive numbers with the intention of getting them sick through a number of sneaky, weaselly, deleterious, cowardly, or hazardous ways, that is an act of terrorism. Okay, a group of people, whether they're directed by the state or not, getting together and conspiring to make massive numbers of people sick with anything. Okay, it doesn't have to be something deadly or something permanent. It could be simply the common cold. Okay, if massive numbers of people are participating in a directed mechanism to take those bacterial germs, to take those bacterial mechanisms and fling them at people, either through coughing, intentional coughing, sneezing, or conversations at that person, with the intention of transmitting whatever your bacterial problem is to them. That is mass attacks. That is a mass biohazardous attack on the American people. And let's roll it back, okay? For a hypothetical, let's say I'm the only person in the United States that experiences that from other persons, and I experience it daily, okay? What that will constitute is a directed attack at a sovereign United States citizen by the state. Okay, gangstalking is not an interstate militia. It's not an interstate co-op of concerned citizens. It isn't an interstate group of interconnected or loosely connected friends or like-minded persons. It is state-sanctioned thuggery. Do you understand? This program has roots in Department of Defense and Department of Justice elements that not all members of the Department of Defense and Department of Justice are aware of, but those are sort of the ground zero auxiliaries that led to clandestine gangstalking. And it is easy to draw parallels between COINTELPRO, which was a 1960s era FBI program, and gangstalking. They operate very similarly with respect to mobilizing the community as weapons against targeted persons. So because of their similarity, it is not difficult to make the connection between gangstalking and its governmental forerunner. Let's talk about the attempted vehicular homicide and the aggravated vehicular homicide mechanism. And I'm going to start this off by saying something very plain and clear. If you use your vehicle as a weapon against other people, not necessarily out of a simple act of road rage, but as a organized mechanism, that is terrorism. And I'm going to say this once more. If you use a 5,000-pound vehicle, or any vehicle for that matter, as a weapon against a pedestrian or another motorist, in any capacity whatsoever, whether it's to cause a collision or whether it's to cause a obstruction of movement, and you are acting as a part of a organized mobbing element or a signal taking element or any element that will constitute many persons acting under guidelines for this kind of activity, it's state-sanctioned organized crime, it's state-sanctioned mobbing, it's state-sanctioned terrorism, it's state-sanctioned vehicular homicide, and it's state-sanctioned attempted vehicular homicide. Okay? A person's movements have to be surveilled, documented, and relayed from one party to another in order for a signal to be sent to a vehicular motorist to dart in front of that person or to collide into that person. You see, how does a motorist know who to dart in front of? How does a motorist know who to collide into? It's not instincts. It's not that person's judgment. They are given some kind of an alert by pedestrians or other motorists that the person walking down the street, that the person at the crosswalk, or that the person who is seated somewhere is the target that you are to obstruct or assault with your vehicle. I have not gathered data personally on the number of car accidents that happen every year in the United States. But I can promise you, ladies and gentlemen, that at least half of all the car accidents that occur in the United States are staged, derived, and organized. Why? Because it gives people, United States citizens, the opportunity to control who drives and who doesn't. And that makes them feel like they have control over society. If I'm a person who is a daily driver of an automobile and I have the intention of participating in a state-sanctioned cabal of angry or aggressive drivers who need persons or other vehicles to take out their daily frustrations upon, then that is, quite frankly, the definition of organized thuggery. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the very definition of organized crime. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the very definition of terrorism. 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. And it doesn't have to be a vehicle. It can be a motorcycle. It can be a motor scooter. It can be a moped. It can be an electronic skateboard. These are all vehicles. And anyone who rides in such a vehicle can be instructed while they're moving to dart in front of or collide into a pedestrian. And I can promise you, ladies and gentlemen, gang stalkers make no differentiation between man, woman, or child when they are instructed to either cut someone off aggressively or collide into that person. They will collide into a man, a woman, a child from the cradle to their senior citizen years. They don't care. All right, and furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, I invoke my First Amendment right to the United States Constitution to say what I'm saying now and in the future. I value that right as my most potent weapon against clandestine gang stalking, given its scope and given its capabilities. Have I been hit by a car? I've been tapped. I was not injured, but the act was obviously synchronized. Has my significant other been hit by cars while walking across the street? 3 years ago, yes, she was. And she suffered a laceration on her left arm that required treatments to heal. Okay? She was 63 years of age when it happened. Vehicular motorists do not care. If they're given the signal in order to obey and be a part of and be an asset to this cabal of anti-pedestrian vehicular units that have the capacity to wreak havoc in the lives of pedestrians and other motorists alike, it is the truth, ladies and gentlemen. It is the truth. And it is terrorism because you are using vehicles essentially as armored weapons and battering rams against unsuspected United States citizens. And this is across the socioeconomic spectrum, ladies and gentlemen. This is across the demographic spectrum. People who seek to exercise this manner of control over motorists and pedestrians in the name of the state, whether or not they know it's in the name of the state, carry this activity on in all 50 states and in all cities in those 50 states. It is by no means only South Floridians, but you certainly see your fair share of that in South Florida, and that is to keep down the number of pedestrians that walk the streets. It is made to keep down the number of motorists who are on the road, because apparently a number of these stalkers, these liaisons and undercover operatives alike that use these violent maneuvers in cars against pedestrians, particularly targeted pedestrians that they have received alerts and signals to pester with their vehicles. They are trying to communicate the message that you are only to be on the road, on the sidewalks as a pedestrian or a motorist if you are doing something. If you are simply joyriding, if you are simply walking outside enjoying the fresh air, you are a menace and you are a person that has to be obstructed and disrupted. If you are not going or coming home from work, school, church, or an event, you have no right to be on the road. That is the message that's being conveyed. If you are a pedestrian and you are not walking somewhere of importance to you or someone else, you are a menace traveling and need to be obstructed or assaulted by a 3,000 to 5,000 pound vehicle. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, vehicles that weigh 10,000 or more pounds, like Mack trucks, school buses, metro buses, party buses, and 18-wheelers are also used in this mechanism. And because a lot of those car accidents result in the demise of the motorist or pedestrian, this is an organized system of mass murder, which puts it in the terrorism category, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about the person-to-person assault or violent crime mechanism that is a prevalent staple of the gangstalking mechanism. There are various points in time where a targeted person is approached by a stalker, liaison, or undercover operative who has been pre-programmed, pre-directed, or pre-instructed via signaling mechanisms, verbal commands, or other gestures to assault or present to the targeted person the fear of assault by the approacher, by the predator. These matters are a matter of terroristic proportions, because if an attacker who would not otherwise attack you sees you, identifies you as the target, and proceeds to your exact location with the intention of attacking you, okay, there is no end to the possibilities of harm that could come to the target as a result of that attack. I do not doubt for any second at all that a lot of the assaults, robberies, rapes, and murders that occur here in South Florida and around the country are targeted and structured. Okay? I do not have the figures in front of me as to how many assaults, rapes, or robberies end in the demise of the targeted person, but I can promise you that at least 50% of them are derived, strategic, and staged. Why? Because that person, that target, was predetermined by a third party to be some sort of a suspicious person or a threat, or perhaps they're being punished for something that happened recently or years ago. And it's possible you're being attacked on behalf of another person who has plugged into your gang stalking campaign, who has requested or paid a liaison to orchestrate the attack against you. And ladies and gentlemen, I am going to again assert my First Amendment right under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution to make the assertions that I'm making out of a sense of personal duty, not only to my fellow men, not only to my country, but to constitutional values and precepts which I have now, have in the past, and will in the future hold dear. Ladies and gentlemen, terrorism is not a difficult thing to identify. When the United States designates a country, for example, of being a state sponsor of terrorism, there is a criteria that is met. And one of those criteria is the use of weapons against massive numbers of people in a synchronized or coordinated attack mechanism. The firearm industry benefits from terrorism. The explosives industry benefits from terrorism. There are various other weapons industries that benefit from terrorism, because you can't be a terrorist typically without the use of weapons. Although if you are a person that goes from town to town or from city to city physically assaulting people, and those physical assaults, any number of them, result in the murder of your target, that is terrorist activity. The scope of what is terrorist activity has transformed from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s to the present day. For example, in Oxford, Michigan, several years ago, there was a high school boy named Ethan Crumley who went into his parents' safe, took out their handgun and ammunition, went to his high school, and shot and killed 4 people. He was arrested that same day and was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of terrorism. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. He probably should have been charged with those things. If I'm not mistaken, he was charged as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In my own mind, that was the right decision. I'm not sure that a 15-year-old who commits an act of that level of atrocity is rehabilitatable, which is what his defense attorney, Paulette Lofton, argued. And mind you, she argued their case for rehabilitation and 50 years in prison very eloquently and very effectively. However, the mental problems that boy had, and his capacity for violence at the tender age of 15, not only against persons but animals as well, is something that is indicative of a human person that is, quite frankly, defective from the ground up. If a 15-year-old boy can be charged and convicted of terrorism for the deaths of 4, then a state can be seen as complicit in acts of terrorism for the deaths of 40,000, 400,000, or 4 million. There's no telling, ladies and gentlemen, how many persons throughout the United States, particularly over the past 25 years, have lost their lives because of synchronized activity around them, not only by motorists, but by persons as well. To the untrained eye, it looks like an accident. To the untrained eye, it looks like a coincidence. To the untrained eye, it looks like happenstance, but it is staged, it is derived, it is synchronous, it is state sanctioned, ladies and gentlemen. And as I've said in previous lectures, whatever this program is, this program called clandestine gang stalking, whatever it presents itself as, whatever its auspices are, it's possible that it was rooted in national security mechanisms meant to surveil and disrupt the activities of illegal aliens and or terrorists. However, at some point, this program fell into the wrong hands, its blueprint fell into the wrong hands, its auspices fell into the wrong hands, it became corrupted, and it began its havoc on the lives of so many people. When a program reaches this level of terroristic capacities, under the guise of something good, like social engineering or community-oriented policing, or simply righting a wrong, these acts of retribution being carried out by Citizen A against Citizen B using state resources and the intention of causing destruction to Citizen B are not lawful. They're not lawful under United Nations or human rights capacities. They're not lawful under the Constitution, and they're not lawful under local statutes and ordinances either. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that state-sanctioned terrorism has happened in the United States, possibly as a matter of mechanism and negligence, as opposed to four-star generals or Pentagon officials sitting down at a table and negotiating ways to exact various controls over the United States populace using synchronized means. Ladies and gentlemen, there is absolutely no limit to who can participate in clandestine gang stalking and who cannot. Persons who cannot are typically persons who are themselves targets. For example, I could never participate because I'm a target, and it has probably been predetermined somewhere that I am either suspicious, deleterious, or problematic to this person or that person. It's possible that a person in my past or present has expressed to the right persons or person that they are afraid for their lives because of my very presence in this country, and the result is a state-sanctioned disruption mechanism that follows me from city to city and state to state in the interest of the person who has expressed fear of me personally. There is no legal process. This is extrajudicial. There's no habeas corpus. There's no sentencing procedure. There are no prosecuting or defense attorneys. There's no jury. There's no judge. There's nothing but an authorization to constantly pester and surveil me, even attack me and try and spread germs to me via a number of mob-like factions that have strategically been activated in the United States in various capacities and in various cities and states. Ladies and gentlemen, terrorism is not something that has any place in the human family or in human society, although I can promise you that it takes place here in the United States. And you may ask yourself, well, where does Cuba's designation as a terror state play into this? Well, I'll tell you where it plays into it. Where it plays into it is this. Terrorists can plug into gang stalking campaigns, just like anyone can plug into an existing gang stalking campaign. So if terrorists wanted to plug into my gang stalking campaign, all they'd have to do is pay off my liaison or arrange some sort of a transaction with my liaisons, and they would be able to gain immediate, synchronous, and real-time access to my location 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and twice on New Year's. Are there terror cells operating here in Miami-Dade County? I believe that there are. Are these terror cells connected in any way to the Cuban government? I believe that it is. I think it's unfortunate that Cuba has, as a government, obviously not all the Cuban people are participants in this state-sanctioned terrorism module, but its government appears to sympathize with terrorist causes and assist terrorists in various activities. I am of the mindset that given Cuba's proximity to the United States, that there are terror cells operating in the United States that have the assistance and the help of the Cuban government. And I would just like to say, ladies and gentlemen, that governments are corruptible. All I can do is hope that the Cuban government is one day cleansed of those persons that participate or finance terrorist activities. Even if that means existing officials changing their ways and abandoning terrorism so that it can once again be in the good graces of the United States, that would be a nice thing. But until then, I believe Cuba has earned its terrorist designation. I do not live in North Korea, Iran, or any of the other countries that the United States has designated as terrorist. So I cannot comment on whether or not I believe that North Korea and Iran are terrorist countries. I don't meet many Iranians in my day-to-day life. I don't meet many North Koreans in my day-to-day life. When I hear about North Korea and Iran in the news, obviously they're two different countries and they are very separate in their political ideology than the United States. And it's difficult to quantify what things they do that the United States sees as terrorist actions are terrorist actions. But I happen to live in Miami-Dade County and have lived here for a period of almost 10 years now. And I have seen the synchronous activity and the guerrilla warfare tactics that various citizens here, which is made up of a population of about 85% Cubans, use against persons on a daily basis. Whether they think it's right or wrong is irrelevant to me. Guerrilla warfare tactics, which are very terroristic in nature, are used here in South Florida against U.S. citizens, regardless of your background, regardless of your demographic, and regardless of your socioeconomic status. That means to me that these tactics, which have been plugged into gang stalking campaigns as weapons against targeted persons, have the capacity to be classified as state-sanctioned terrorist actions. Now, when you talk about the trajectory of things like biological terrorism over the past 40 years, it has metamorphosized just as gang stalking has. Getting people sick is a favorite weapon of gang stalkers because it doesn't require you actually putting your hands on a person. It doesn't leave marks or bruises. And it accomplishes the objective of harming a person by stealth. If you knowingly and willingly communicate a bacterial or other disease to a person, and that person begins to suffer from the symptoms related to that disease, you have assaulted that person. If that person passes away from the disease, that is murder. It's aggravated murder that you've committed. Because these very mechanisms are ingrained into the gang stalking mechanism, that in itself makes gang stalking terroristic in its operation. Thank you for tuning in.